All right. Thank you for joining us tonight. We very much appreciate you being a part of this study and grateful for another opportunity to study together from the book of Proverbs. The Proverbs have a particular purpose in mind, and that is to help me and others like me from being foolish, speaking to us, trying to get us to make better decisions. And so it's worth our time to look at the book of Proverbs. It's given in little bite-sized pieces, I suppose, that we are to take and to chew on and meditate on to try to understand and then make application to ourselves and our lives and how that might change our conduct, our attitude from day to day. That's the value of this book. It is a book given to show us the course of wisdom. And wisdom is defined by the choices we make and the attitudes we keep. So I appreciate your interest in this study. It's one that I think even those who are wise need, those who are young, those who are old, those certainly that are foolish, that have made bad decisions or feel that they're not where they need to be. This book can help all of us. So it's with that in mind that we approach it. And we left off last time we were together at Proverbs 25 and verse 25. So I invite you to take your Bible and turn with us there as we begin our study this evening. Proverbs 25:25, the Old King James reads, "As cold waters to a thirsty soul, so is good news from a far country." Good news from a far country. Some of the fellows that I read after made application here, particularly to Solomon. He's the king, and he has these ambassadors, throughout that region of the world, and and all the political scheming that goes on. It's great to have good news that comes from some ambassador from afar relating to whatever policies might be involved, and maybe that's so, but we'd hardly be able to limit it to that, it seems. I think this is true across the board. We can think of Bible stories where good news came from a distance and brought great joy. One of the ones that comes to mind rather quickly goes back to Genesis 45 in the story of Jacob. You remember the setting here after Joseph was stolen away and sold into slavery. It was thought by Jacob that he was dead. He was led to believe that by his evil sons. And for many years, Jacob considered his son, his beloved son, to have been killed. And it's here in this passage that, of course, as the story goes on, Joseph is risen to be a great leader in Egypt and has sent for his father to come and to live out his remaining years in his company and in his care. So it's just news that's almost too good to be true. And that's the setting of this passage. This is Genesis 45 and verse 25. They went up out of Egypt and they came into the land of Canaan unto Jacob their father and told him, saying, Joseph is yet alive, and he is governor over all the land of Egypt. And Jacob's heart fainted, for he believed them not. And they told him all the words of Joseph, which he had said to them. And when he saw the wagons which Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of Jacob their father revived, literally came to life. And Israel, that is Jacob, said, It is enough. Joseph, my son, is yet alive. I will go and see him before I die. Like cold water to a thirsty soul, can you imagine the joy in the heart of this father, the shock and amazement and pleasure he would have had at receiving such news? And so it is. Now, we might ask the question, so what? What is the point here? I don't think that the Proverbs are given to us just to relate facts, and certainly not just obvious facts. Cold water tastes good to a thirsty man. Good news is good to get. Um, but what does that say to me about my behavior? Um, well, I think one lesson that can be learned from this proverb uh, might be this, that we simply ought not to neglect sharing good news. Do you think that's something people need to be told? I think sometimes it can be. Um, there's no doubt about the fact that there's a power in good news. There's a blessing that comes in sharing encouraging words. I was thinking of another example in 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and in verse 6. And the setting here, you remember, is that Paul had written to the church at Corinth, a troubled church. He wrote a very hard letter. We call it 1 Corinthians. He really wasn't sure how they might react to it. Titus had gone to Corinth. He was supposed to come back and report to Paul up at Troas. He didn't show up there. Paul is greatly concerned about not only about the Corinthians now, but about his good friend. But that's where 2 Corinthians 7 comes in. They did meet up, and what he received there was great news. This is from a modern speech translation of 2 Corinthians 7 and verse 6. Yet God, who comforts those who are dejected, comforted us when Titus arrived. We were comforted not only by his arrival, but also by learning about the comfort he had received while he was yet with you. He told us how you wanted to see me and how sorry you are for what you've done and how concerned you are about me. This made me even happier. I'm sure it did. Good news has a power. We would not want to neglect sharing that power. Um, uh, there's another example of this same principle. When Paul wrote to the Thessalonian church, this is 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. Again, a situation where the gospel was planted at Thessalonica, and almost immediately the young Christians there came under trial and persecution. Paul had to leave the city because he was drawing even more heat on the brethren there. And yet, as he writes back to them later, he's greatly relieved, having heard that they were not washed away by the trouble, but they stood. And that's the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and in verse 5. Let's begin reading there. Let me start in verse 4. Verily, when we were with you, we told you before that we should suffer tribulation, even as it came to pass, and for this cause, when I could no longer forbear, I sent to know your faith, lest by some means the tempter have tempted you and our labor be in vain. But now, when Timotheus came from you unto us, and brought us good tidings of your faith and charity, and that ye have good remembrance of us always, desiring greatly to see us, as we also to see you. Therefore, brethren, we were comforted over you in all our affliction and distress by your faith. But now he says, we live if you stand fast in the Lord. Wow, that's quite a statement to me. I don't suppose Paul ever had a day in his life as a Christian where there wasn't something weighing on him. There wasn't some trouble or trial. But he talks about and writes about very plainly about what a blessing it is in the midst of trouble to receive some good news and to be able to know that there were some good things going on. All of us, even a man as strong as Paul, needed to hear that good news. And I say all that to say, do you think there are times when we fail to appreciate that, or at least fail to exercise that blessing? I don't know. Maybe maybe there are exceptions to this, but I suspect in just about every family, there's somebody that you only hear from when they got trouble. They don't ever call you up and say, "Hey, things are going great. Something great happened to me today." If you hear from them, it's bad. They need help. Something. Well, we need to help each other. But it is nice to hear something good once in a while. I was thinking about uh, among brethren, in congregations where you have men qualified and appointed to be shepherds, elders over the local church. What a hard job that is. When a man signs up to be an elder, a shepherd over God's people, um, he's joining a group of men that to deal with problems, that try to solve issues, that are concerned about guarding the flock against wolves. And there are a lot of difficult things there. It'd be a great shame if the only time we had contact with the elders is when there was a problem, when we had a complaint. That's just not right. We ought to think about the power of good news. We ought to be able to call a guy up sometime because something good does happen once in a while, and share that with them. So I just want you to know, we've gained something here. Something is good is taking place. There's a strengthening that's happened here. I just want you to know about that. You don't know how that can be refreshing, like a cold water to a thirsty soul. So it can be, and not just the elders, but with one another. We are called to weep with those that weep, but rejoice with those that rejoice. So I think that's a lesson, a practical lesson that we can draw from this passage. There's another lesson that may be implied here. At least Mr. Wybray thought it was. Um, he offered this thought about the passage. He said, we are intended to picture a man expecting news of a crucial importance. This man who is to wait maybe weeks or months with growing apprehension, not even knowing in view of the hazards of travel when it will reach him. The relief when the news arrives and proves to be good is overwhelming. And he goes on to make the point that there might be here implied the idea that there's a need for patience, especially in the day in which this was written. I suppose the Roman system of roads and transportation had made mail service, for example, uh, much better and much more reliable, but it was still incredibly slow compared to what we're used to now with instant everything. But there may be times when we're called on to wait to find out the outcome of a matter. That's true for all of us. And so I think one lesson that we might learn when we have to wait in this passage, news from a far country, news that's not going to be instant. I think common sense and maybe the principles of God would teach us patience to recognize, well, first of all, if the news is bad news, we were in no hurry for it anyway. And if the news is good news, it's worth waiting for. And so learn of patience about yourself. And if you have good news to tell, some good encouraging word, don't neglect to share it because there's power. Like cold water to a thirsty soul, that's the power of good news. One more point that someone shared. There are those who had made some spiritual application to this in the sense of a messianic application to it. One fellow wrote that he couldn't think of better news from afar than the idea that Jesus has come to save us from our sins. I'm not sure this passage intended to be messianic, but that is true. It's good news from afar, and it's a great blessing to hear. And that's news that we ought to be willing to share as well. It certainly is refreshing to a weary world. Okay, let me go ahead with the next verse, verse 26. Verse 26 reads, a righteous man falling down before the wicked is as a troubled fountain and a corrupt spring. Have a comparison. You have the picture here on the one hand of the old King James reads, a fountain and a spring. It's ironic that actually the word here for fountain seems to be a word which is better translated a spring. The word for spring seems to be more in line with the idea and its other usages of a well, a dug out place. Be that as it may, we'll just call it that. We'll talk about a spring and a well. Here's a blessing. You need water. And made the point before, growing up in the luxury that we've had all our lives, most all of us. We think well comes from a tap. We've got several of those in our houses, even in very modest houses in these days. You go back a few generations and people knew what it was to draw water, to try to find water, to dig wells, and so on. For so many of us, it's something we take for granted. But the idea here is of a time when that was not so, and a spring was precious, and a well was precious. Actually, we still rely on those sources. We just don't realize it, because we have the mechanization. So anyway, here's a fella who understands he needs a spring or a well. He's traveling, maybe as the case might be, and he knows where a source of water is. But when he gets there, what he finds is a troubled fountain, a corrupt spring. This word troubled simply means to stamp, to tread, to foul by treading. Something or someone, animals, whatever it might be, has made a mud hole out of this spring, ruined it, marred its use, just muddy water, just a mud hole. Here is a well, but instead the well has been corrupted, ruined, maybe poisoned. So here is that which we need and anticipate, but the blessing has been turned into poison. What's the comparison? The comparison is with a righteous man falling down before the wicked. Righteous and wicked are common terms in the Proverbs. Here's a just man, and here is a man who is anything but just, morally wrong, actively bad. But it's the just man who falls down before the wicked. In what sense does he fall down? I think most people understand it, and I think this rings true. As one fellow wrote, the verse, one of the most profound in the whole book, does not speak of the misfortune of the righteous. In other words, this is not a matter of falling down. It's not his tornado took his house out, or a flood or some such thing. That's not the sense in which he's fallen. It's a moral fall. The fall of the righteous, whose sin compromises the holy cause which he serves. It reminds us of what happened with David in the Old Testament. And we all remember from the story of David the most tragic and painful part of his life when he committed the sin with Bathsheba, and when he was convicted of that sin. This is 2 Samuel 12 and verse 13. And Nathan has been sent to him to hold the mirror up, as it were, to David, to show him, David, you must face up to the evil that you've done. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord hath put away thy sin, thou shalt not die. Howbeit, because by this deed thou hast given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, then certain consequences would come as a result of that. David's conduct had caused great occasion for the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme his holy name. The picture here speaks to that. A righteous man having fallen down before the wicked. Other translations read, give way before the wicked. Good people who don't stand strong before the wicked. Another says compromises. And so that's the picture here. What a tragedy it is when righteous people compromise their principles and the damage that they do, not only to themselves, but to the cause of God as a whole. One fellow wrote, to see a righteous man move from his steadfastness through fear or favor in the presence of the wicked is as disheartening as to find a stream turbid and defiled at which you were longing to quench your thirst. Another on that same point says, when such a man for fear or favor, when he talks about fear or favor, what does he mean? He means here's a man, a righteous man who's moved from his righteousness. And whether that's because you threatened him out of his position or you flattered him out of his position. Both of those are powerful forces. They can move a fellow like a strong wind can move him if he's not careful, if he's not rooted. And so through fear or favor, weakness or weariness, such a man yields to the wicked, compromises principle, no longer makes a stand for truth and purity and virtue. He loses his high character, brings a scandal on religion, lowers his own spiritual nature. It is this moral cowardice which Christ so sternly rebukes in Matthew 10:33. And that's right. You remember that passage, Matthew 10, verse 33? There the Lord gave warning, lest we weaken under the pressures of this world. Matthew 10 and verse 32, let's begin there. Whosoever therefore shall confess me before men, him will I confess before my Father which is in heaven. But whosoever will deny me before men, him will I deny before my Father which is in heaven. There's a great deal of damage that comes when a man who knows the truth swallows his conviction. In the words of our passage here, when he makes a mud hole out of a spring, when he falls down before the wicked, such a decision will cause great trouble to himself and to others. Such a man, one fellow put it this way, he said, a righteous man who loses his position is useless. That may seem harsh to you, but isn't that exactly what the Lord said? In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13, isn't that the point here? You're the salt of the earth. But if the salt hath lost his savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is thenceforth good for nothing. Read that again. It is thenceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out and to be trodden under the foot of men. It is a genuine tragedy whenever you have the picture of a righteous man who surrenders his righteousness before the wicked, compromises with the world, and brings shame upon himself, upon the name of the Lord that he wears, and discourages and misleads others looking to him no little. One fellow made that point. He said, just like in the picture that the wise man draws of a well, people in an area go to that well. They know where it is. They look to that well. If they're traveling, they know they can count on that well. But now it's become poisoned. And he said, just like that, there are people teachers, Bible teachers, that we may come to trust, and yet because they compromise, now those who would be influenced by this man will be misled and will follow him into error. That's a very modern problem. It's been around a long time. Wolves in sheep's clothing. Or in this case, those who at one time were faithful, but now they have fallen. And as a result, as I said, they hurt others as well as themselves. We think about the Apostle Peter in Galatians 2, who stood condemned, Paul said, because by his bad example on that occasion, you remember he withdrew from certain Gentile brethren and allowed his fear of what somebody else might say about that situation to influence him. His influence had an effect upon others, Barnabas included. The point is that it's a tragedy on many levels when a righteous man falls before the wicked. And it's a danger that all of us must keep in mind. Okay. Let's go to verse 27 now, if we may. Proverbs 25:27 reads, it is not good to eat much honey, so for men to search their own glory is not glory. Now, if you're looking at this verse in, for example, the King James or some related translation, you might notice there's several words in italics here. And there are different views of this passage. And I've thought about it, and I don't really think it would be the best use of our time to go through and explore, half a dozen different ideas about a passage. I'm going to present what I think to be the best idea, but I just make the point there may be other views of this passage and the meaning of it here. But as it's given to us in this translation, in most translations, he pictures the idea, another comparison. On the one hand, eating too much honey isn't good. Honey's not bad, but it can be abused. And so he says for men to search their own glory, search, to always be looking for something. One fellow said, seeking applause. You know, the idea of praise is not in and of itself bad, uh, but there can be a bad attitude about it. There can be a craving for it that can lead to disastrous consequences. Warning, I think most people believe in this passage against that pride that leads to self-promotion. Got a lot of that going on through the years. It was certainly not unknown in the Lord's day. When Jesus was teaching on earth, he saw a lot of that in the Jewish leaders, religious leaders of his day. Matthew 23, I think we need to read a verse or two from this passage as we think about this proverb. And while you're turning there, I might just remind you, it's interesting how people, they have this idea about Jesus teaching that Jesus was so um, mild in his approach that he would never hurt anybody's feelings or never been in any way contradictory of other people's ideas. Very strange how people had put these ideas on the Lord. Um, Certainly, the Lord was. There was a meekness about Jesus. There's no question about it, a gentleness about it. But in dealing with these individuals, these hardened enemies of the truth, these dangers to the public welfare religiously, he was extraordinarily blunt. I don't think he was at all unkind. He certainly wasn't being untrue, but he was intensely plain about who they were and what they really were after. And his lesson to them is a warning to all of us. He talks about how that when they say true, believe them, but don't try to follow their actions because they don't live what they teach. He said in verse 5, we'll just pick up there. All their works they do for to be seen of men. They make broad their phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garments. This religious garb, boxes that carried portions of scripture, maybe a parchment that would be tied about the head or about the arm, borders of the garments. The old law had said something about a reminder on the garment, but they had taken that passage and made another empty ritual out of it. They love the uppermost rooms at the feast, verse 6, and the chief seats in the synagogues, and the greetings in the marketplace, to be called of men, Rabbi, Rabbi. Oh, Father, Father, Teacher, Teacher, Master, Master. Oh, they love the religious titles and the religious garb, and they were extraordinarily proud men who demanded to be treated a certain way. Could you say that they were seeking glory? Jesus thought they were. He said in the first place, verse 8, be not called rabbi, for one is your master, even Christ, and all your brethren. And call no man on earth your father, for one is your Father, which is in heaven. Neither be called master, for one is your master, even Christ. Religious titles are still a problem today. The Reverend Lord Dr. So-and-so of so-and-so. You just you hear all of this elevated language that's just out of place. It violates the very spirit of what Jesus is saying here so long ago. He said, all your brethren. It's not a matter of lording over others or big me, little you. Ought never to be that way. He that is the greatest among you shall be your servant. Then he said in verse 12, whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased. He that humbles himself shall be exalted. So Here's an example of people seeking after glory. Not wrong to praise good, but those who seek self-promotion are those who bring destruction upon themselves. The contemporary English version reads this way: don't eat too much honey or always want praise. Uh, not very poetic, but it does get to the point. People want praise. They're very concerned about who gets the credit for this and for that. Here's a good rule for Wes to learn and everybody else too. Maturity as a Christian involves not caring who gets the credit. Let the good be done. And whoever gets the credit, let the Lord have the credit. But seeking glory, self-seeking spirit, is the very opposite of the Spirit of Christ. He that is greatest, let him be servant of all. Just serve and let that be enough. And let the Lord praise you for whatever might be praised. I think about the Apostle Paul. He was in a jail in Rome, and he wrote the church at Philippi, and he pointed out that while he was taken away from the work, there were others who had jumped in, and some of those teachers were honorable men and just trying to do the right thing, and some of them were self-promoters. And even though they were teaching the truth, they really were teaching out of a rivalry spirit. They thought that maybe they could get a leg up on Paul, and receive the praise of the brethren, whatever it might be. One preached Christ of contention, he said in Philippians 1:16, not sincerely supposing to add affliction to my bonds. The other of love, knowing that I am set for the defense of the gospel. Verse 18, what then, notwithstanding every way, when pretense or in truth Christ is preached, I therein do rejoice, yea, and will rejoice. If they thought that I was going to be jealous because they were preaching and that I wasn't going to be getting the credit or in the limelight or whatever might have been involved in this, he said they could not be more wrong. If somebody is preaching Christ, glory, even if their attitude might rule them out from being blessed for it, I still am glad. Whoever gets the credit or gets the glory or gets the opportunity, let it be done and let God be glorified. That's the spirit. Praising someone is not bad, but seeking praise, being obsessed with the idea of getting the credit, is a deadly thing. It's unspiritual. It's devilish. It's destructive. That's a great lesson that's needed today. In Proverbs 25 and in verse 28 is another great picture drawn by the inspired writer. He that hath no rule over his own spirit is like a city that is broken down without walls. A city broken down without a wall. You get the picture here of ancient times and cities that depended on, that were tied to, their security was tied to having a wall. Today we can fly over a wall, you can send ordnance over a wall, but a wall was a sense of great security at that point in time. But a city without a wall was not really a city. It was just waiting to be conquered. One translation translates our passage this way, that a man has no rule over his spirit is like a city city with breached walls. So was a man without self-control, as the passage goes on to say. It's the very opposite of what we find in Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 32. Whoever controls his temper is better than a warrior. And anyone who has control of his spirit is better than someone who captures a city. We talked about that some time back. That's a great picture. People praise war heroes and they talk about the great conquerors of history. Let me tell you, the great battle, the really great battle that any man can fight is the battle against his own desires and lusts. The wise man said that a man that can conquer himself is the greatest warrior and the greatest conqueror of all. Doesn't that remind you a little bit of what we find over in the New Testament in the book of James? James chapter 3 is a passage that we have looked at along and along. We remember it because this is the passage that has so much to say about our tongue, our speech, and the danger that our tongue poses for us. It's in the context, you remember, really, of people who want to be teachers, that ambition we talked about a moment ago. Brethren, he begins the chapter, the thought, verse 1 of chapter 3, brethren, be not many masters, knowing that ye shall receive the greater condemnation. You want to be a teacher. You have ambitions. But James' point is, how in the world, you can't even control yourself. How are you going to help anybody else? That's the way he concludes the thought later in the chapter. Verse 13, who is a wise man and endued with knowledge among you? Let him show out of his good conversation his works with meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and strife in your hearts, glory not, neither lie against the truth. This wisdom descends not from above. It's earthly and sensual and devilish. Where envy and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. The wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy, good fruits, without partiality, without hypocrisy. The fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace. He begins and ends this thought by saying that those who would desire to be teachers must first teach themselves. That's a great lesson. It's still true. And if you're not even in control of your tongue and your hateful attitude, then how can you help anybody else? That's a sobering question for all of us as Christians. It goes back to this idea we have to win the battle within. That's where it starts. It's similar to the Lord's lesson about pulling the beam out of your own eye that you might see clearly to pull the mote out of your brother's eye. I don't think it means you have to be flawless before you can talk to anybody else. But it certainly means you cannot ignore your own problem and major in inspecting others. That's the truth. And in James 3, in between these two bookends, he has some very powerful things to say about controlling ourselves. Verse 7, he compares the fight with the idea of taming a beast. The Proverbs compare it with conquering a city, or a city in this case without walls, the security of a city. Here, taming a beast, every kind of beast, this is James 3:7. Every kind of beast and of birds and of serpents and of things in the sea is tamed and hath been tamed of mankind. You know, that is true. You can see people who can make lions sit up like a little puppy dog. There are people who tamed all kinds of critters, but he said, the tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil and full of deadly poison. Therewith bless we God, even the Father, and therewith curse we men, which are made after the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessings and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not so to be. I used to read that as a young student of the Bible, and I would wonder, what kind of message is that? You can't tame your tongue? Is that a hopeless message? I don't think it's at all intended to be hopeless. And I don't think he's saying there that we can't exercise self-control. I believe the point to be that the tongue will always be a danger. You can never turn your back on this wild animal. You might think you have charge of it, but you won't if you let down for a moment. It'll never be tamed. It must be controlled. And I believe that's the point of the proverb as well. You never let your guard down, because if you do, you're defenseless for all kinds of evil. A man who does not have control over his tongue will do so much damage and so much harm. Everything will be at risk. And so he says, you have to be careful, constantly on guard. ruling your spirit, in control, fighting temptation. I like what Mr. Bridges wrote about this passage. He said, certain of the noblest consequences are gained or lost over ourselves. The first outbreak of anger resulted in murder, taking us back to Cain there. We see that from the very first stories of the Bible. A man with no rule over his own spirit. A king's lack of watchfulness about lust resulted in adultery, and so much more. Talking about David, of course, and all the damage that was done, all the lives affected by his lack of self-control. Every sign of irritation, he goes on to say, every spark of pride burning in the heart, long before it shows itself in the countenance or on the tongue, must be firmly resisted. What should we do? Upon the first assault, fortify the walls by prayer. That's a great point. He says here, long before that word gets to my tongue, it's in my mind. And I've got to be on guard to make sure that my mind is pure. How do you do that? You have to guard what you put in your mind, what you expose your ears to and your eyes to. But that's the fight we're fighting here. This is not a simple matter. It's not easy. It's a constant struggle. That's why the wise man said, a man that can control himself is the greatest conqueror of all. Or in our passage, a man who has no control over himself, who has no rule over his own spirit. He's like a city with no walls, no defense. So be on guard. That message was needed 3,000 years ago, is needed tonight. And it's certainly needed by me. Well, maybe that's a good place to stop. We're ready to start chapter 26 next time, Lord willing. I'll mention this to you. Appreciate you joining us tonight. We tried to get word out to everybody, and I apologize if you didn't get word. We have been doing this study on Wednesdays at 7 live, but we plan to be meeting at the building, Lord willing, tomorrow, and we hope into the future. But we do want to continue this study. There seems to be some interest in it, and I appreciate that. And so what we'll try to do is to present this live on Tuesday nights at 7. And we'll hope that you'll be able to make use of it at that time. So again, thanks so much for being a part of this. We appreciate your interest in the study. And until next time, we bid you a very pleasant good day.